Hello, everyone. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Tom. I'm a professional baseball player, and this series is about my recovery from Tommy John surgery. If you're not new here, everything I just said is still true, but welcome back, and thank you for watching. Last time I checked in, I was talking about how rehab can definitely drag you down mentally, but that I had a nice thing to look forward to and that I'm supposed to start facing hitters this month, which is an exciting step as it's more or less getting down to the last step in the rehab process, the return to competition in controlled situations. I actually tested this out briefly just to see how it felt, basically throwing the last 10 pitches of a bullpen to a hitter because there just happened to be one in the facility at the time. It went fine, I threw strikes and felt good, everything seemed to be moving the way I wanted, but you don't really get a great feel for how your stuff is playing just by facing the same hitter for 12 pitches. Also, getting right-handed hitters out isn't generally my biggest issue, so I consider this one more of a warm-up than anything. Now, as a low slot righty, my usual issue is left-handed hitters. To try to combat this, I've worked pretty hard over the last few years developing a changeup that has significant vertical separation from my fastball, and that was no small task considering my arm slot and the fact my fastball usually averages 0 inches of vertical break. But over time, I was able to make it work. Now, this has helped, but in rehab, one of my goals was to try to tweak my arsenal to make it the best it could possibly be, and the best thing that I could figure that I was missing was a pitch that was hard and broke somewhat glove side, so some form of a cutter, basically. Now, you might look at how I throw and think that throwing a cutter from my arm slot is going to be pretty much impossible. And yeah, you're pretty much right. Throwing a true cutter like a Kenley Jansen or a Mariano Rivera type of cutter will definitely be impossible from my arm slot. For me to get actual glove side break past the 0 line on this chart and velocity that would make it effective would be pretty difficult. However, I don't necessarily need to throw a true cutter. Let me explain. Since my fastball runs so much, I really just need to throw a pitch that doesn't run, and to the hitter it will appear to cut, or at very least it will act as a cutter, hopefully. The real goal is just to split the difference between my fastball and slider, which have a horizontal movement spread of anywhere from 35 to 40 inches on most days. Now, it is cool that I have this much movement difference between what are my primary two pitches. Regardless of what else I add to the arsenal, I'm pretty much always going to be a sinker-slider guy. But in terms of getting guys to swing at pitches, which is half the battle in getting swings and misses, having that big of a difference, and especially a horizontal difference, is really not ideal. Because these pitches have such a huge spread, it makes them borderline impossible to actually tunnel. The plate is only 17 inches wide. You'll notice that in the overlay I just showed you, even though both pitches start on the same path, neither one actually ends up in the strike zone, which is not terribly useful. Even if I dot a fastball inside to a righty, a slider that starts on that same path is ending in the lefty batter's box. For those of you who aren't as deep into pitching development stuff as I am, tunneling is when you can make two pitches look really similar for a long time, making the pitch harder to identify and effectively giving the hitter less time to actually make a decision about whether or not they should swing. When you see a hitter wave at a slider in the dirt and you're wondering what the hell was he swinging at, the answer is almost always that they were swinging at the fastball that pitch tunneled off of. A slider in the dirt will generally start off looking a lot like a fastball at the bottom of the zone, and so often hitters have to make the decision to start swinging at that pitch before they can recognize that it was actually a slider, and oops, now it's too late to stop your swing, and so you gotta do your best to try to put your bat on the ball. Boom. Tunneled. Since my two main pitches have an incredibly significant movement spread between them, it's probably actually really easy for hitters to tell them apart out of my hand, and hitters that I've spoken to have confirmed this. Apart from some extreme examples, I'm usually relying on the outlier movement that I get and unusual release point that I have to keep the ball off their barrel. And it's worked out fine for me so far. I just think that having the cutter would be a useful tool in forcing more swing decisions out of hitters. I actually had this idea once before, about 6 years ago. The issue was the pitch that I came up with at the time I really couldn't command, and there was a tendency for it to back up and be sort of a worse, slower version of my fastball. I only ever actually threw one of them in a real game, and it was hit for a triple, and I never threw it again. Amazingly, that exact pitch is pictured on my first professional baseball card, and I know this because that is the grip of that cutter, and that is the only one I ever threw. I have a bit of a better grasp on pitch design now than I did then, and I have a slightly different movement profile in mind for the pitch, but I think it's still pretty reasonable to achieve. Normally, on a movement plot, the zone that you would count as cutters is over here for a quote-unquote normal pitcher. The old cutter that I tried to throw was around here. I wanted it to at least get to the 0 line, but it was too difficult for me to get it there and also throw it as hard as I wanted to. The area that I'm aiming for with the new cutter is over here. Basically, I'm just trying to get the horizontal movement down enough that the ball will seem to the hitter like it's cutting, even though it is not actually, and still throwing the pitch hard enough, but under control. The little bit of upward movement I'm hoping to get, which I strongly believe is achievable, will help with the pitch being just kind of weird and hopefully make left-handed hitters really uncomfortable, since a pitch that feels like it's coming up and into them from my arm slot should be pretty unexpected and probably not a welcome sight. Now, I've obviously been toying with this idea for a while now, and I've been attempting to throw it in bullpens, but I think I was a little too eager and I started throwing it before my body was actually really ready to, leading to most of them not being very good and some of them being very not good. However, I did manage to throw a couple of them that were the movement profile I was looking for, which was proof of concept at the very least, which is all I was really looking for at that point. Overall, I think I knew that my body wasn't quite ready for it though, so I mostly laid it to rest until that was sorted out more. Now that I'm getting ready to face hitters again and my arm feels a good bit stronger, I think it's time to really give it a shot. Especially because what I think is a good pitch or an ideal movement profile is one thing, but the hitter's reactions could tell me something else entirely. The only real measure of a pitch, as far as I'm concerned, is how it performs against a guy 60 feet 6 inches away trying to hit it over the fence. However, this is where we run into a little bit of a snag. Cutters are sort of an odd type of pitch. They generally rely on seam-shifted wake for some, if not all, of their movement. A very brief explanation here. There are two different forces that account for how a baseball moves. The Magnus effect, which more or less says that a rotating object will move opposite the direction of its rotation as air is pulled along the surface, and the other is laminar flow, or more specific to a baseball, seam-shifted wake. Basically, it's a cool thing that happens because the seams of a baseball aren't perfectly symmetrical, and if you get the seams to be in a certain pattern while the ball is spinning a certain way, the ball will move way differently and way more than you think it would. There are currently two different pitch tracking systems that are the standard in baseball for getting pitch movement metrics in a training setting, Rapsodo and TrackMan. They each have their benefits and drawbacks. Rapsodo's is that while the unit is much cheaper and much more portable and easier to set up, the movement it gives is estimated based solely on the Magnus effect, and it doesn't/can't read or take into account possible seam-shifted wake. TrackMan, on the other hand, is radar-based, and it tracks the entire flight of the ball and how it deviated from its initial path. Then it gives an estimate of what the spin axis and spin rate of the ball must have been in order to achieve that movement. As an example, my slider is a seam-shifted wake pitch. Here's the numbers for it on Rapsodo, generally spinning between an 8:30 and 9 o'clock axis, pretty much pure side spin at its best, and the movement numbers ranging from 10 to 15 inches of glove side movement and -4 to +1 inches of vertical movement. Here it is on TrackMan, with anywhere from 16 to 24 inches of horizontal movement and +1 to +6 inches of vertical movement. Now, it's incredibly likely that to achieve the movement profile that I want on my cutter, I will also need to get some seam-shifted wake. But I'll only know that for sure if I'm throwing on a TrackMan. The only TrackMan that I really have access to is Adam Ottavino's in the lab, and the lab isn't equipped to have hitters in there. So I won't be able to have the true movement numbers on my cutter and face hitters at the same time, which is definitely a little bit of a hindrance to the pitch design process. Again, the real test of whether it's good or not will be how hitters react to it, but knowing how it's moving and also how they're reacting would be pretty useful. I've also been trying to take as much video of the cutter as I can and comparing it to fastballs just to make sure that there is some movement difference. And I think that I'm starting to get the feel for it, and so I decided that my first real live, I would take the cutter out there and see how it felt, and just give it a shot at least. I ended up throwing 4 or 5 overall, and they were relatively successful in my opinion, especially because I was throwing to an L screen because our catcher had to leave right before I started throwing. My initial concern was commanding it, as you can probably tell based on most of the ones that I've shown so far in this video. Who can say where the road... But once I was on a mound and focused on throwing it to a spot against a hitter, the results were definitely better. I definitely still zooed a couple, but I was pretty happy with more than half of them, and I think I put them where they should have gone. And I think that's pretty good for my first time throwing it to hitters. And it seemed to have the movement difference from my fastball that I was looking for, so I'd have to call this a success. It'll obviously take a few more times out to really see what feels comfortable and how it's working, but as of right now, I'm pretty happy with where this pitch is at. Anyway, that's all for now. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.